And let's continue. Something fundamental is shifting beneath our feet, and Venezuela is the clearest indicator of this transformation. For decades, Washington operated under a simple assumption: economic sanctions, financial pressure, and diplomatic isolation could force any nation to bend to American will. But that assumption is no longer holding. What is happening in Caracas right now illustrates exactly why Venezuela has endured the most extensive sanctions ever imposed on a country in this hemisphere. We are talking about financial blockades that prevent them from selling oil, freezing billions of dollars in assets, cutting them off from international banking, and creating measures designed to collapse their economy and force regime change. This was not subtle. This was maximum pressure applied deliberately and consistently over many years. Yet, Venezuela remains standing. More than surviving, the country is rebuilding its relationships with other nations, securing new trade partners, and demonstrating something Washington never anticipated: that American economic dominance is no longer absolute. This isn't a question of whether Maduro is a good leader or not. The key issue is the structural change, reshaping global power. The unipolar moment, the brief period after the Cold War when the United States could dictate terms worldwide, is ending. Countries are now discovering alternatives. China offers financing without political conditions. Russia provides military cooperation without demanding regime change. India trades in its own currency instead of relying on the dollar. Turkey, Brazil, and South Africa are forging their own paths. The tools that once worked, those that were effective in 1990 or even 2010, are losing their power because the structure of global power has fundamentally shifted. Venezuela is simply the most visible example of this transformation. What happens there next will determine whether Washington can adapt to a world that no longer controls alone. Let's be very clear. The debate about Venezuela is not primarily about Maduro's governance or the state of democracy there. Those are important questions, but they are secondary to the structural issue. Why have the most comprehensive sanctions in modern history failed to achieve their stated goals? And what does that failure reveal about the world we live in today compared to 20 or 30 years ago? The United States began seriously sanctioning Venezuela in 2014, and those measures intensified dramatically under the Trump administration. By 2019, Venezuela was effectively cut off from the international financial system. Its access to foreign-held assets was frozen. American companies were forbidden from dealing with Venezuelan state enterprises. Other nations were warned that purchasing Venezuelan oil or conducting significant trade with Caracas could expose them to secondary sanctions. This was economic warfare executed with precision, designed to do one thing: force regime change by making the costs of Maduro's continued rule unbearable for both the Venezuelan population and the country's elite. Consider the scale of what was attempted. Venezuela's oil, the backbone of its economy, was blocked from international markets. PDVSA, the state oil company, was sanctioned, cutting it off from global banking. The central bank was frozen. And even the nation's gold reserves held abroad were inaccessible. Humanitarian goods became difficult to import because banks, fearing the complexity and risk of violating American sanctions, refused to process legitimate transactions. This phenomenon, known as overcompliance, meant that even legally permitted activity was avoided entirely to minimize risk. The result was catastrophic. The Venezuelan economy plunged further, and the humanitarian toll was immense. Yet, regime change did not occur. And here is the critical question: what changed? There was a time when this strategy would have been fatal in the 1992 and early 2000s. Exclusion from dollar-denominated trade in Western banking systems was a death sentence for any government. Back then, American economic dominance was so absolute that isolation from Western institutions meant isolation from the global economy. But that world has ended. Venezuela's survival demonstrates it clearly. What sustained the country despite crushing sanctions? The answer is simple: alternative partners. China, Russia, Iran, and Turkey stepped in where the West withdrew, providing markets for oil, government financing, technical support, and crucially, access to financial systems independent of the dollar. China had already extended over $60 billion in loans during the Chavez era, much of it backed by future oil deliveries. When sanctions intensified, Beijing didn't abandon Caracas. Instead, it renegotiated repayment schedules and continued accepting Venezuelan oil. Russia facilitated oil exports to Asia and offered technical support to maintain Venezuela's oil infrastructure. Iran sent fuel when domestic refineries failed. Turkey helped monetize gold reserves, providing much-needed liquidity. These relationships are transactional, sometimes exploitative, and not without cost. Chinese and Russian companies negotiated highly favorable terms. But the point is that alternatives now exist in ways they did not a generation ago. Venezuela found buyers, financing, and trade partners willing to work outside the dollar system or under complex barter arrangements. The American toolkit that once worked financial isolation, exclusion from global markets, denial of credit, encountered a world that had fundamentally changed. Sanctions no longer carry the same coercive power because the architecture of global economic influence has shifted. Let's look at how this works in practice. By 2024, trade between Russia and Venezuela had increased by 64%, significant reorientation of economic relationships. The two countries signed strategic agreements covering hydrocarbons, military cooperation, and even space technology. These aren't symbolic gestures. They are functional arrangements that allow both nations to circumvent Western sanctions. When Chevron finally ended its Venezuelan operations in 2025, after years of operating under special licenses, the vacuum was not filled by economic collapse. Instead, Venezuela deepened its integration with non-Western partners. China's role is especially revealing. Beijing's engagement is pragmatic, not charitable. Chinese lending to Venezuela slowed after 2016 when it became clear the country could not service its debts. Yet, China did not foreclose or demand immediate political concessions. Instead, it renegotiated repayment schedules, accepted oil at discounted rates, and maintained ties serving its strategic interests in Latin America. This is a different model of international engagement. It isn't necessarily better or worse in moral terms, but structurally, it is transformative. It shows that countries can maintain economic lifelines even under extreme Western pressure. Venezuela is not alone. Iran provides another example. When the United States withdrew from the nuclear deal in 2018 and imposed maximum pressure sanctions, Iran's oil exports plummeted, its currency collapsed, and inflation skyrocketed. By conventional metrics, the economy was devastated. Yet, the Iranian government survived. It strengthened relations with China, expanded cooperation with Russia, and developed sophisticated networks to evade sanctions. Russia demonstrates this pattern as well. After Western sanctions following Crimea in 2014, and again after the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, analysts predicted economic collapse. The ruble was expected to plummet, industry to grind to a halt. That did not happen. Russia redirected energy exports to Asia, sourced technology outside the West, and created alternative financial systems. Growth slowed, living standards declined. But the state functioned, war efforts continued, and domestic control persisted. The common thread among Venezuela, Iran, and Russia is not authoritarianism, although that is a factor. It is the realization that these nations can survive outside the American economic order. This is historically significant. It demonstrates that tools of economic statecraft, which were devastatingly effective 3 decades ago, now have limited coercive power. The rise of alternative centers of economic gravity, primarily China, is the key driver. China possesses the financial resources, technological capabilities, and political influence to offer countries alternatives to Western integration. Developing countries now have leverage. When Washington demands political or economic reforms to access finance, these nations can turn to Beijing and ask, what can you offer? China's Belt and Road Initiative is the most visible manifestation of this new system. Over $1 trillion have been invested across Asia, Africa, and Latin America, often with far fewer political conditions than Western loans. China's demands focus on strategic support, market access, and geopolitical positioning, not domestic economic reform or democratic restructuring. Technology plays a similar role in this transformation. For decades, access to advanced telecommunications, digital payment systems, and satellite technology was dominated by Western companies Ericsson, Nokia, and American providers. Today, alternatives exist. Countries can turn to Huawei, ZTE, or Chinese fintech platforms. Satellite technology, digital infrastructure, and even social media platforms no longer require dependence on American corporations. This diversification matters because sanctions often rely on controlling access to critical technologies. When alternatives exist, sanctions lose much of their impact. Venezuela sourced oil industry equipment from China. When Western suppliers were blocked, Russia developed alternative payment systems with Chinese and domestic partners when cut off from Western banking. This isn't about preference. It's about necessity and opportunity. The dollar, along the cornerstone of American economic power, is also beginning to lose its monopoly. The dollar remains dominant, but dominance is not the same as exclusivity. China and Russia have conducted bilateral trade in their own currencies for years. BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, along with new members like Iran and Saudi Arabia, are actively discussing non-dollar settlement mechanisms. Saudi Arabia has even begun accepting yuan for some oil sales. These changes are small relative to total global trade, but historically significant. Major economies are deliberately building financial infrastructures designed to bypass American oversight. The motives are clear. Trading in dollars subjects countries to U.S. jurisdiction, makes them vulnerable to sanctions, and risks asset freezes. Reducing dollar dependence reduces exposure to American coercion. Regional and international organizations play a role as well. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization and BRICS, often dismissed as talk shops, are creating forums where non-Western powers coordinate alternatives to the U.S.-led system. While these institutions have internal divisions and are not replacements for Western-led structures, they symbolize and increasingly facilitate practical multipolar cooperation. Latin America is particularly illustrative. Historically, the region was considered America's backyard. The Monroe Doctrine established a framework for U.S. dominance over the Western Hemisphere for over a century. Governments aligned with Washington because alternative economic and strategic options were limited. That era is ending. Venezuela is central to this shift. Regional powers like Brazil and Colombia, both U.S. partners, have rejected military intervention and pushed for diplomatic solutions. Mexico continues trade with Venezuela despite pressure from Washington. Even countries skeptical of Maduro resist supporting aggressive U.S. intervention, asserting sovereignty and independent judgment of their interests. China's growing presence accelerates this trend. It is now the largest trading partner for Brazil, Chile, and Peru. Chinese investment spans infrastructure, mining, agriculture, and technology. With these economic relationships, Latin American nations have options. When the U.S. demands disengagement from Venezuela, they can weigh those demands against tangible alternatives. Military power also has its limits. The United States remains the world's dominant military force, but history has shown that even unmatched military strength cannot easily compel political outcomes. Afghanistan and Iraq illustrated that the U.S. can topple governments but cannot reliably create stable, friendly regimes. The human, financial, and political costs were immense. While the strategic gains were uncertain at best, this experience has made policymakers, military leaders, and the public cautious about interventions even in the Western Hemisphere. When U.S. officials suggested military options for Venezuela, the regional backlash was immediate. Colombia and Brazil clearly opposed any American intervention. The political cost of unilateral military action in Latin America today is far higher than it was in the 20th century because countries now have autonomy, alternatives, and the willingness to openly challenge U.S. pressure. Understanding multipolarity is crucial. Multipolarity does not mean the end of American influence. The U.S. remains extraordinarily powerful militarily, economically, technologically, and culturally, but it no longer holds the dominance that allows unilateral imposition of outcomes. In a multipolar world, other powers have sufficient capability to offer alternatives, resist American pressure, and pursue independent strategies. In a unipolar world, the U.S. could sanction a country and leave it with little choice, comply, or face isolation and collapse. In a multipolar world, sanctioned nations can turn to other powers for trade, financing, technology, and political support. Sanctions still impose costs, but the calculation shifts. Governments can weigh the burden of sanctions against the benefits of pursuing independent policies, and increasingly, they find that the costs are manageable. This shift has profound implications for U.S. foreign policy. For decades, economic coercion was a low-cost, effective tool. Disapprove of a government? Impose sanctions. Want policy change? Tighten them. That approach worked when alternatives were scarce. Today, with non-Western partners providing viable options, sanctions still hurt populations, but often fail to produce the desired political results. The humanitarian impact is undeniable. Venezuela has endured widespread poverty, collapsed healthcare and education systems, and mass immigration. How much of this stems from government mismanagement versus sanctions is debated. What is indisputable is that sanctions exacerbate suffering while failing to achieve regime change. This raises an ethical question. If sanctions do not accomplish their goals but inflict severe human suffering, what justifies their continuation? Traditional reasoning assumes that sustained pressure will eventually force political compliance. But in a world with alternatives, that assumption no longer holds. Countries can survive sanctions without conceding to U.S. demands while ordinary citizens bear the brunt. So, what are the alternatives? If sanctions are ineffective and military intervention is costly and risky, how should the United States respond to governments it views as threatening to its interests or human rights? This is the central strategic question facing American foreign policy, and one that Washington has yet to fully confront. The old playbook assumed American dominance gave the luxury of choosing between coercion and inaction. But in a multipolar world, coercion is less effective. A more sophisticated approach is required, one that starts with accepting reality. The United States cannot simply impose outcomes. This is difficult for policymakers accustomed to unprecedented global influence. The period from roughly 1991 to 2008 was historically unusual, not the norm. That moment is over, and clinging to it leads to repeated failures, as we see with Venezuela. A second requirement is building genuine international coalitions based on shared interests rather than unilateral dictate. Multilateralism is often invoked to legitimize U.S. policy, but real multilateralism accepts that other nations have their own priorities. Compromise is necessary, and collective action may be slower or less decisive, but it is increasingly the only way to achieve meaningful outcomes. Third, policy must engage with the world as it exists, not as we wish it were. China is a permanent power. Russia remains influential, and nations will pursue independent interests. Sanctions cannot restore unipolarity. The U.S. must recognize that multiple centers of power will shape the international system, and that influence, while significant, is no longer absolute. In Venezuela, this reality is stark. 20 years of sanctions and attempts at regime change have failed. Maduro remains in power. The opposition is fragmented, and the humanitarian crisis continues. Persisting with failed strategies risks doing more harm than good. A more pragmatic approach would involve direct engagement with both the government and opposition aimed at gradual political liberalization and economic stabilization. This requires accepting uncomfortable truths. Maduro is not leaving in the immediate future, and Venezuela's ties to China and Russia will persist. Any transition will be gradual. But such realism is necessary if the United States wants policy that works rather than policy that repeats past failures. Domestic politics complicate this approach. U.S. public discourse rewards tough rhetoric and punishes perceived weakness. Suggesting negotiation with Venezuela is often framed as appeasement, undermining democracy, or surrendering to dictatorship. Political incentives thus push toward continued confrontation even when it is ineffective and harmful to ordinary citizens. The broader lesson is clear. We are transitioning from one global order to another, and transitions are messy, dangerous, and slow. The unipolar moment is ending. A multipolar world is emerging. Institutions, norms, and practices that dominated for the last 30 years are being challenged. This transformation will take years, possibly decades, and its outcome will determine whether the 21st century is relatively stable or chaotic. The lesson from Venezuela extends far beyond its borders. The United States has immense influence, but it is not unlimited. Clinging to outdated strategies, assuming that sanctions or economic isolation will compel compliance, risks undermining both national interests and credibility. The world has changed, and Venezuela's resilience illustrates this starkly. Despite decades of sanctions, Maduro remains in power. The opposition remains fragmented. Ordinary Venezuelans continue to suffer. This is not a story of Venezuelan strength alone. It is a story of how the global balance of power has shifted. The architecture of international influence has evolved, protecting even weaker governments from the full force of American coercion. This shift requires a fundamental reassessment of policy. Persisting with failed strategies because they were once effective is not wisdom, it is stubbornness. Sanctions are still a tool, but they can no longer be relied upon to achieve regime change or compliance in the way they once could. Meanwhile, their humanitarian costs remain real and severe. The broader implication is that the unipolar world, where Washington could dictate outcomes unilaterally, is over. Multipolarity is emerging. The United States retains significant power, but it now operates in a world where China, Russia, India, and other nations provide viable alternatives to the Western-led order. Countries can now survive outside the American economic and political system. American foreign policy must adjust. This requires realism about both capabilities and limitations. Policies must recognize that multiple centers of power exist and that influence is no longer absolute. Attempting to restore unipolarity through coercion alone is not only futile, it is counterproductive. It risks exhausting resources, creating humanitarian crises, and eroding credibility globally. Venezuela serves as a test case. It is not the only example, nor the most critical, but it is a clear signal that old assumptions no longer hold. American policymakers cannot act as if alternative economic, technological, and political options for other nations do not exist. To navigate this new era successfully, U.S. foreign policy must incorporate strategies that reflect reality, not nostalgia. The fundamental question is whether the United States will adapt to this new world order or continue to act as if the past can be restored. The evidence so far suggests the latter. Economic isolation, political pressure, and threats of intervention persist, but the outcomes have changed. Nations now operate with options that were unimaginable during the unipolar era, reshaping the rules of international engagement. The reality is clear. Venezuela remains standing despite years of American pressure, not because the country is inherently strong, but because the global balance of power has shifted. Even nations under extreme sanctions now have access to alternatives, trade partners, financing, technology, and political support outside the U.S.-led system. This is the reality American foreign policy must confront. Persisting with strategies that no longer work risks humanitarian harm, wasted resources, and global credibility. The unipolar moment has ended. A multipolar world is emerging, one where American influence matters but is not decisive in isolation. The path forward requires acknowledging these truths. It requires adopting a realistic, nuanced approach that balances American interests with the realities of a multipolar system. This means pursuing diplomacy where possible, building genuine coalitions, engaging directly with nations we view as adversaries, and preparing to operate in a world where alternatives exist to our influence. If the United States continues to act as if unilateral coercion is sufficient, it will exhaust itself in futile efforts to restore a past that is gone. But if it adapts, recognizing the limits of its power and the opportunities for cooperation, it can help shape a multipolar world that is stable, prosperous, and relatively peaceful. Venezuela is not just a regional issue. It is a signal of a broader global shift. The sanctions, the pressure, the economic isolation, all of it has failed to achieve its intended outcome. This is a warning. Old tools designed for a unipolar world are no longer enough. The future of international politics will be defined by how nations, including the United States, navigate this new architecture of global power. American